You are kneeling on a stretch of scrubland in what is now northeastern Jordan. Around you, dozens of ancient humans are cutting wild wheat and barley with flint blades, 14,400 years ago. No fields anywhere on Earth. No fences, no farms, just wild grass growing wherever the rain happened to fall, and yet here they are, harvesting it anyway, grinding the tough little seeds between two stones, mixing the flour with water, pressing it flat, laying it into the coals of a fire pit. They are making bread. 4,000 years before a single human plants a seed on purpose anywhere on the planet. That sentence should not make sense. Bread is supposed to come after farming. That is the order everyone learns in school. Humans settled down, planted crops, and then, almost as an afterthought, figured out what to do with the grain. Clean story, simple timeline. And, according to the archaeological record, backwards. So how did ancient humans actually invent bread? The answer stretches back further than agriculture, further than pottery, further than permanent settlement itself, and it may explain why agriculture happened at all. Here is why this matters before we go further. Bread, in one form or another, still makes up a meaningful share of daily calories for billions of people right now. It fed the workers who built the pyramids. It fed Roman legions. It has started riots and ended dynasties. And entire tax systems were built around counting it. Whatever this thing actually is, it is not a minor kitchen trick. It is one of the load-bearing inventions of human civilization, quietly holding up cities, armies, and religions that came centuries after it, and almost nobody knows where it actually came from. Let's start with the discovery that broke the old timeline. In 2018, archaeobotanist Amaya Arans Otegwai of the University of Copenhagen published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining 24 charred food fragments pulled from 2 stone fireplaces at a site called Shubeika 1 in Jordan's Black Desert. Her team had excavated the site between 2012 and 2015. Under magnification, the fragments turned out to be flatbread, made from wild einkorn, barley, oats, and the ground tubers of a clubrush plant. The people who made it were Natufians, hunter-gatherers, nomadic or close to it. 14,400 years old, the bread predates the earliest known farming by roughly 4,000 years. Think about what that actually requires. Not stumbling onto a grain and eating it raw, a full production chain. Harvest the wild grass, strip the husks off by hand, grind it to flour on a stone which takes hours, mix it with water, shape it, bake it in ash. That is at least 5 distinct steps, each needing its own tool and its own learned skill. Nobody wanders into that sequence by accident. It is a recipe. And somebody without agriculture, without permanent granaries, without any of the infrastructure we associate with civilized food production, had already worked it out. And here's something most people don't know. Shubeika 1 isn't even the oldest evidence of grain processing. At Ohalo 2, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, archaeologist Ehud Weiss of Bar Ilan University found a flat grinding stone coated in starch residue from wild wheat, barley, and oats. That site is roughly 23,000 years old. The Ice Age hadn't ended. Mammoths were still walking around, and someone, at the edge of a lake, was already turning wild grain into something closer to flour. Push back further still. At Grotta Paglici in southern Italy, researchers recovered a stone pestle from a layer dated to about 32,600 years ago. It carried starch grains from wild oats that had been heated before grinding. A deliberate processing step, not an accident. Similar tools from the same era turn up at Bilancino in Italy, Kostenki in Russia, and Pavlov in the Czech Republic. 30,000 years ago, across a huge stretch of Ice Age Europe, people in completely disconnected regions were independently solving the same problem. And that problem is the real key to why bread exists at all. Raw grain is almost useless to the human body. The seed is wrapped in a tough, fibrous husk, and the starch inside is locked in a crystalline structure your gut can barely touch. Eat it raw, and you get almost no energy back for the effort. You might as well chew on a twig, but grind that seed to powder, add water, and apply heat, and the starch unfolds. It becomes digestible. Calories that were chemically inaccessible a moment earlier suddenly become available. Milling and cooking grain isn't just food prep, it's a chemical unlock. And here is the detail that makes it strange. Compared to other great apes, the human gut is small. We traded intestine length for brain size somewhere in our evolutionary past, which is a bad trade if your diet is raw plant matter, because raw plant matter needs a long gut to extract much from it. Bread is, in a very real sense, an external stomach, a processing step performed outside the body because the body itself is no longer built for the job. Here's where it gets stranger, and this is where the story stops being purely archaeological. In 2024, a research team led by geneticists at the University at Buffalo and the Jackson Laboratory sequenced the amylase gene AMY1 in 68 ancient human genomes, including a sample from Siberia dated to roughly 45,000 years ago. AMY1 controls the enzyme in your saliva that starts breaking starch down the moment bread touches your tongue. The team found that pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers already carried on average 4 to 8 copies of this gene per cell, and that the first duplication of the gene likely happened more than 800,000 years ago, before modern humans even split from Neanderthals. In other words, the genetic hardware for digesting starch-heavy food like bread was already built, tens of thousands of years before anyone farmed a single stalk of wheat. Your body was quietly preparing for bread long before your ancestors knew what bread was. So if the biology was ready and the technique existed, why does the old story insist farming came first? Because for decades, the assumption ran in only one direction. Agriculture creates surplus grain gets turned into bread. Shubaika 1 flips that. And a growing number of archaeologists now argue the causation may run the other way entirely. This is the twist worth sitting with. Bread made from wild grain is brutally labor-intensive. Hours of harvesting for a small yield, hours more of grinding by hand, and yet the product once made is extraordinary, energy-dense, storable, portable. Multiple researchers now suspect early bread wasn't an everyday meal at all, but something closer to a prestige food baked for gatherings, feasts, and ritual occasions. Which brings us to Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Built by hunter-gatherers around 9,500 BCE, thousands of years before anyone in the region farmed, its massive carved pillars show clear evidence of large-scale grain processing on site. The late archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavation, argued that feeding the crowds who gathered there for ritual purposes may have created exactly the kind of sustained demand for grain that eventually pushed people toward deliberately planting it. Not farming, then bread. Possibly bread, then farming. The urge to make more of a desirable, energy-rich, portable food may be one of the forces that dragged humanity into agriculture in the first place, with everything that followed. Permanent settlements, cities, writing, the whole chain reaction. Picture the scale of it. Göbekli Tepe's pillars weigh up to 10 tons apiece. Moving and carving stone at that scale takes coordinated labor for weeks or months at a stretch, and coordinated labor needs to be fed. A prestige loaf handed out at a gathering is one thing. Feeding the crews who dragged 10-ton stones across a hillside is another problem entirely. And it is exactly the kind of problem that turns gather wild grain occasionally into plant grain deliberately every season in the same place. Once cultivation did take hold, the wild grasses themselves had to change. Wild einkorn's seed head shatters naturally when ripe, scattering grain on the ground, useful for the plant, useless for a harvester. Genetic and archaeological evidence points to the Karakada Mountains in southeastern Turkey, close to Göbekli Tepe itself, as the region where einkorn wheat was first domesticated somewhere around 8,500 to 8,000 BCE. Early farmers, likely without understanding the genetics involved, simply kept replanting seeds from the plants whose heads didn't shatter generation after generation until a wild grass had quietly become a crop built for human hands. And here's a rehook most people miss entirely. The soft, air-filled loaf you probably picture when you hear the word bread needed one more ingredient nobody planned for: yeast. Genomic studies of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the species behind both bread and beer, point to an origin in China, with the domesticated lineage spreading west roughly 16 to 14,000 years ago along the same general corridor that would later become the Silk Road. That timing sits almost exactly on top of the oldest confirmed bread evidence, which means the microbe that eventually gives us a risen, airy loaf may have been moving into position before agriculture existed anywhere. The oldest confirmed leavening technique on record, mixing dough and letting it sit until wild yeast took hold, is documented in an Egyptian tomb dated to roughly 2450 to 2401 BCE. Someone left dough out too long, discovered it had changed, and rather than throwing it away, baked it anyway. Flat, dense survival food slowly became something closer to what fills a bakery window today. Was bread invented once, in one place, and then spread outward across the world? The evidence says almost certainly not. Wild grain processing tools from 30,000 years ago appear independently in Italy, Russia, and the Czech Republic, regions with no contact with one another. Flatbread traditions developed separately on nearly every continent. Corn tortillas in Mesoamerica, teff-based injera in Ethiopia, wheat naan across South Asia, pita around the Mediterranean. None of these cultures were in contact when their flatbread traditions emerged. Given how consistently the same physical constraints show up, a starchy plant nobody can digest raw, a stone to grind it, water, and fire, the probability that this was a single invention that spread from one origin point sits at somewhere under 5%. The far more likely scenario, north of 90% by most archaeologists' estimates, is that ancient humans invented bread independently, over and over, on nearly every continent where the right raw materials happened to exist. Not one invention, a convergence forced into existence by the same unforgiving chemistry everywhere humans and starchy plants ended up sharing a landscape. Tomorrow morning, you will probably eat bread. Toast, maybe, a sandwich by lunch. You won't think about the 14,000 years of trial, labor, and slowly shifting genetics that put it within reach of your hand without a second thought. You won't think about the Natufian who knelt in that same stretch of Jordanian desert, grinding a nearly worthless wild seed into something a body could finally use. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the genetic hardware for digesting starch was already sitting in our ancestors' DNA tens of thousands of years before anyone farmed, how many other modern inventions are we still assuming happened in the wrong order?